I distinctly remember the voice of the Lord saying to me that your father really was an embodiment of the Spirit of Christ in the earth. He was showing humankind what it means to be loved in action. And he gave us that example.
Welcome to Interactions, a podcast exploring how law and religion interact in today's world and throughout history. In this season of Interactions, Terri Montague and I, Brandon Paradise, engage with contemporary leaders and social change agents regarding the influence and convergence of Christianity, the law, and racial justice in their work. This podcast is produced by the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University in collaboration with CanopyForum.org. Today is the first of two episodes with the Reverend Dr. Bernice King. Not only is Dr. King the daughter of Corretta Scott and Martin Luther King Jr., she is also a social activist in her own right and regularly speaks truth to power. As the CEO of the King Center, Dr. King teaches the principles of nonviolent resistance, honors and shares her father's legacy, and protects against its misuse. In this episode, we talk with Dr. King about her parents and the foundation they have laid for today's community of activists. Dr. King, let's start with your father's legacy. How old were you when your father was assassinated, and how did his murder shape your relationship to his legacy?
So when my father was assassinated in 1968, April 4th, I had just turned 5, 1 week prior, literally 7 days prior, March 28th. Of course, I didn't know a lot about the work that he was doing at the time. And obviously, grew up with my mother talking to us at dinner time, especially I remember those times about how they were trying to make the world better for all people, and especially those that were the least of these, as she described it. And so there was a documentary called Montgomery to Memphis that we started watching in our household that began to help me to understand what my father was really involved in, my father and mother, should I say. And it really wasn't until I probably was in my teens that I fully realized that my mom and dad were trying to deal with conditions of racial discrimination, economic injustice, and more importantly, poverty. And additionally, militarism, as they called it. Some people say war. The daddy referred to it as militarism and war. And so through time, studying, eventually I studied my father. I didn't initially because I got called into the ministry at the age of 17. And being a teenager, I wanted to finish being a teenager. I kind of saw the role of a minister is very serious and, mature. And I didn't feel like I was at that stage to step into that role and responsibility. And also, I was concerned about my own identity. Would I be swallowed up in my father's identity because he was a pastor, and would my life be about the shadow of Martin Luther King Jr.? So I ran from that for about 8 years. And even during the time period that I decided to go to theology school and law school at Emory University, I was at Candler and still wrestling with whether or not I was going to answer this call. And I did so in 1988. I started Candler in 1985, fall of 1985. At that point, I had not studied much. I just heard about my father, saw some films, hadn't really acquainted myself with much of his writings or anything. I heard periodic, sermons or speeches. I took one course. I think it was with Dr. Noel Erskine at Candler. And I don't even remember the name, but it was a Martin Luther King Jr. course. So that probably was my first real engagement outside of the context of what my mother shared, going through the nonviolence training workshops as a preteen, as a teen, and the documentary, and a few, other things. Uh, and I still did not want to delve heavily into any of that. So it took about, I would say, about a good 10 years before I really started engaging some of his books. So I was well into my 30s before I started even reading my father seriously. And I think if I fast forward to today, where I serve as the CEO of the King Center, I can honestly say it's being in this role of leadership that has kind of propelled me and pushed me to delve even more deeply into his writings, his teachings, and in particular, his thinking, grounded, I believe, in scripture and in his faith, um, obviously blended with a lot of the theologians and the philosophers that he studied, and then, the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi.
Although you did not initially deeply engage your father's work, you have come to be a serious student of his teachings. How do you see yourself as an extension of his legacy?
I see myself as kind of extension of who he was in this way. I was flying back to Atlanta from a trip. I think it was somewhere in the ballpark of 2010, 11. And at that particular time, I was wrestling with who I am as a minister of the gospel, advancing the kingdom of God, and who I am as the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., Corretta Scott King, but in particular, my father. And how do I reconcile what I saw kind of as his ministerial side, the spiritual side, with this kind of secular side, because I was speaking in a lot of secular audiences. And I felt very conflicted. Um, and I distinctly remember the voice of the Lord saying to me that your father really was an embodiment of the Spirit of Christ in the earth. He was showing humankind what it means to be love in action. And he gave us that example. And when you hear King of Kings, because we use that phrase quite often, but we never stop to think, okay, you're King of Kings. Well, who are these kings that you're King of Kings? Who are these kings? And he said, that's who your father was. He was one of those kings. And he gave an example. And your name, Bernice A. King, is be a king. So he was showing people how to be it. And your job now is to kind of push people to say, now, this is the example of how we manifest Christ in the earth because we're so far away from the Bible. So here's a more current manifestation of what that means. And so I see myself as extending his legacy because the things that he taught around nonviolence and the dignity and the value and the worth of the person, the imago Dei, so to speak, is what seems to be missing and lacking in today's society. We don't have a true reverence and respect for that in humankind. And so that's how I see my relationship as carrying that forward, out of his nonviolent teachings.
Thank you, Dr. King. In listening to your response, it reminds me of what a powerful force your mother, Corretta Scott King, was, and the ways in which she was a significant activist in her own right. Many Americans primarily associate her with successful efforts to have the national holiday recognized in your father's name and honor. But what else should we remember about Corretta Scott King?
Well, the first thing is I want people to understand that she was not a widow, or she was more than a widow. Let me say that. Um, that when my father was assassinated, it was a poll that indicated the percentage of people who really hated him. So he was one of the most hated persons in our nation. And now, when you look at Martin Luther King Jr., his legacy, his work, um, he's one of the most loved persons in the world. But why is that? Um, Arguably because he's no longer with us, and so much of the work that he was doing, some of the very powerful words that he was speaking to us, he can no longer, feel like a threat, so to speak. Um, some people would argue that, yeah, we have an affinity for dead folks, so we're comfortable now. It's the comfortable king. But during his lifetime, it was the one who made us very, uncomfortable, as I said in January at the commemorative service here in Atlanta. I said the inconvenient king. But really, for me, it's because Corretta Scott King carried that legacy forward in a very strategic way. She knew how to plan and implement, and she knew who was needed to help her get things done. So she was very thoughtful and intentional, and deliberate in much of what she did to ensure that Martin, as she called him, would be institutionalized in our nation. She was doing it not as a person who lost a spouse and was trying to figure out, how do I carry his work forward merely. She was doing it as an effort to continue the work that they were doing jointly. And he just happened to be, his life just happened to be taken from us early in the process. So she's praying, like, okay, how do we capture all of this? So if you go back, this was a woman who, before she met Martin Luther King Jr., understood through time, of course, from her early years, asking questions, which is very important for children, the curiosity, why am I here? What purpose do I serve? How do I change whatever it is that, is right before me, that is troubling, that is unjust, that's disturbing, that needs to be different? Asking those questions and going on that journey, things started revealing themselves to her at Antioch College, where she attended. So she was a part of the progressive political party there. She was a part of the NAACP. She was a peace activist. So by the time she met Martin Luther King Jr., she had already been prepared to engage in the work that they jointly engaged in with so many others, and had a foresight to understand the moment in history that they were in.
It seems your mother appreciated the importance of history and your father's work for future generations in ways that even he may not have imagined. What should we be carrying forward in her example?
She clearly understood, because she said it, that freedom, struggle is a never-ending process. Freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it in every generation. But where are those tools, where are those examples that we can utilize in our generation, that we can extract from that historical time period? And so, as she, you know, uh, began to develop this legacy, I mean, he left so much behind, but as you know, you can leave stuff behind. And if there's nobody there to steward it forward, then it dissipates and it gets lost. So she knew that this was an important thing to be preserved, so that future activists, future organizers, future leaders, that society in general would be able to use those same tactics. And so she thought about, okay, now that they did this, what can we institutionalize for them so that they will have what we were exposed to and utilized in their movements. And that's why for her, it was about ensuring that the King Center would be founded in terms of his philosophy and methodology of nonviolence, that it would, at the heart and soul of it, it would empower current, future generations in utilizing the Kingian philosophy and methodology of nonviolence to address, conflict, interpersonal conflict between nations, to address injustices in society and around the world, to create a beloved community. And so she was a preservationist. When we think about her, she's the architect of this legacy. She built one of the largest and most powerful, if not the largest social change brands, if I can use that word, in the world, and very powerful. People are still studying and learning from it and utilizing it. It's just so much here. But she also knew about building coalitions to get stuff done, and she knew she had an ability to study people, and this is the thing about both of them. They knew what was needed, the type of person that would be needed for different roles and functions. They both were gifted in that regard. And that's so important, particularly in struggles today, because right now it seems like if you are passionate about a cause, whosoever will, let them come. But we don't know how to determine where are people best suited. And so sometimes we malfunction because we have people in a protest who don't have the discipline to be a part of that protest. And they can undermine the efforts, the nonviolent efforts that are happening. We don't understand that everybody doesn't have the capacity and discipline to sit at a table of negotiation, because they become extremely emotional, and their words will sometimes get in the way, and their inability to really hear and try to understand the other side, so what argument that you need to put forward. So all of this in Corretta Scott King, and the first speech that Martin Luther King Jr. made as the leader of the Montgomery Improvement Association in 1955, when the bus boycott started. It was my mother who said to a member of the church, because she couldn't go to the service. She had just delivered my sister. And so she said, take this tape recorder, because I want you to capture what Martin says tonight. And that's a good part of the reason why we have that, first very important speech. I can't even imagine what it would be like if we didn't have it. He really captured what they were doing there in Montgomery.
So, did your mother encourage her children to get actively involved, or was she more protective in wanting to shield you from those exposures too soon?
So it was a balance. She was very sensitive to age and what she felt was appropriate for you to be exposed to at certain times. With that said, there were things that she did, encourage us to become a part of. There were things that she made sure that we were exposed to, but she never intentionally put her agenda on us. What she did is she exemplified certain behaviors. As I said, she made sure that we were surrounded by certain environments. She built the King Center out of our home. So it was right there with us. We grew up with it. We, the staff that came into the basement of our home, and then the things she talked about as I said, at the dinner table quite often about the work that they were doing. But the greatest thing she did for me, to allow me to just eventually evolve into the person that I am today, without feeling a sense of uh, resentment, is you do not have to be me. You do not have to be your father. But whatever you do in this world, just be your best self. So that has relieved me over and over again, even as I do work similar to what they're doing. When people have said, ugly things, you don't represent your father, uh, your father would be ashamed of you. I remember what my mother said. You don't have to be me. You don't have to be your father, but be your best self. And so that's what I strive to do on a day-to-day basis. And even as I'm, making decisions, I'm not perfect, of course, because I'm still growing, with, my own issues, even around anger. I have to do a lot of work in that area, so that my tongue doesn't become a weapon of destruction.
Thank you so much for sharing all those candid insights.